Hello? This is a book titled For Good and Evil, The Impact of Taxes on the Course of Civilization by a Charles Adams. Back of the book says he has a degree in history and philosophy and a Doctor of Law degree. And he has published scores of historical and contemporary articles on taxation. The book is a sort of history of taxes, and it has a very personalized view. The author is very clear from the very beginning, his understanding of taxes, how they should be seen, what they are, whether they're good or bad. As well, the author is obviously opinionated in other ways as regards his view of, say, high taxes, or his view, he seems to be a Southern, in this American Civil War, one of those people who doesn't think slavery had anything much to do with it. And this is sort of reflected in some of his other views. Right? He's what I would have called a traditional Republican or a libertarian viewpoint. Small government is best. Government is the best, which doesn't do much. And so on. So all his examples of taxes are in this vein. It's a little conspiratorial sounding, or perhaps a little anti-establishment in a way. He was, for example, not a fan of Roosevelt's New Deal, as far as I could tell. And that's interesting, I suppose. But it also contrasts with the speech I read yesterday, which is about, how we ended up in the Great Depression by not doing anything and just letting the same old laws and economic policies continue, which led us into the Great Depression, because that was the result, the risk we took. So with that understanding in mind, that this is not the best book, I think, for learning entirely about taxes, because it is a very opinionated book. The author seems to have a certain view, and the information he gives is obviously colored in certain ways. So I hope that eventually I'll find another book, run across one, that talks about taxes in a more middle-of-the-road fashion. But for now, this is what I have, and considering that his views do not parallel mine, it's a place to start, right? To understand what's going on. So it's written in a historical fashion. Begins in ancient Egypt, goes into the ancient Israel and ancient Greece, to Rome, to the Middle Ages, talks about Russia, the Swiss, the Americans, the tax that beat Napoleon, British, and a bit about today. It was written 1993, so it's a little out of date, but since it starts from ancient Egypt, not that out of date. Okay, so to begin, he says, the similarity between tax collectors and robbers is also found in the basic meaning of the word taxation, which means forced exaction. Taxes are not debts, despite the fact that we carelessly refer to them as such. The principle of fair value received, which is the basis for legally enforceable debt, has no place in a tax dispute. A tax is owed because the government orders it to be paid, nothing else is required. So this is obviously debatable, right? I mean, part of the basic claim for taxes is we pay taxes so that something is done with that money. We pay taxes so the government, functions, and we have law houses and police and roads and so on. But the point of view he is espousing here from the very beginning is that tax is theft. That the tax is something we pay because the government demands it. And I was reading, I was on Facebook a few days ago, and I ran across this bit in the neighborhood Facebook group, which I am on for some reason. And it was some person complaining about their rising taxes. And they're like, okay, why is my property payment an extra $400 or so this year? What happened? I can't afford that. And the replies I thought were interesting. Basically, every person replying, and given that this is a neighborhood Facebook group, these are pretty much people who own houses or who rent, people with jobs, probably older folk, given that we're talking about Facebook and the neighborhood group. So their views are basically that, why are we paying taxes? What are we getting for this? The taxes are a cost to survive, and why am I having to pay taxes? The government raises these taxes on us, and it's just stealing from us. And then others are like, well, why did y'all vote for more taxes? If you didn't like taxes, you kept voting for taxes. And the tax raise was apparently for a school bond, right, to build or repair school buildings. And the replies were like, well, why did you vote? You voted for this. What do you think is going to happen? And so on. They were all very negative views. Not a single person in this long line, I think it was maybe 30 comments I read, said, well, your taxes are going to a good cause. Your taxes are going to the students. Your taxes are doing something. Not a single person said this. Instead, it was all about, oh my gosh, this is horrible. We're paying more. And this view is what the author espouses here, right? The principle of fair value received, we get what we paid for, has no place in a tax dispute. Taxes are not debts. And, from the very beginning, I have to say, well, taxes in a very certain way are debts. The United States as a nation is in debt, and that debt is predicated upon the idea that we will pay taxes to the government, which will then pay back that debt. And the government is us. We voted it in place. We keep it in place. So taxes, at least part of our taxes, are a debt. And some of our taxes are maintenance on roads and bridges. Some of our taxes, on the other hand, are for exploratory events, let us say. It's for the government to spend on promoting certain ideas, or having studies done, or giving grants for technology, or spending on spies to create and expand an intelligence network. To upgrade old computers, to make sure that our elections are run fairly and swiftly, and so on. These are a more complex point, right? Because the example of the Facebook group I was reading, where it was about a school bond to raise property taxes, then it's not taxes to maintain something. It's not taxes for a debt. Instead, it is taxes to do something else, right? And this is a more debatable stance to have. I don't want the government to be doing this. I don't want the government to be doing this. I don't want to pay my taxes for this. In the United States, there were plenty of people who, during the Vietnam War, didn't pay taxes because their taxes were going to support a war overseas that was doing nobody any good, going to support an undeclared, unconstitutional war, and so on. So I think that may be a better way to stand. And of course, when the way taxes are used can be questionable, right? If I pay taxes and I get nothing back for them, then I'm thinking there's something wrong. If I am paying taxes, but the roads suck, the schools suck, the food is unsafe, the power goes out randomly, our soldiers can't protect us, we end up spending money just trying to get anything done. If we have to bribe, sanitation workers, or we have to bribe some paper pusher in an office somewhere to get a marriage license done, or to get the license to build a house, or to get some planning papers looked at by the person who needs to certify that the structure of the house we plan to build is safe and meets the local ordinances, right? Then we have to start asking, well, why on earth are we paying taxes, right? If I go to the courthouse and it costs me $25 to file this or $25 to file that, then why am I paying taxes? Right? The taxes are supposed to cover these basic things. And that's the question, right? These basic things. In America, if you are accused of a crime, you are given access to a lawyer. And these lawyers are public defenders who are paid out of the public purse. So this is the most basic, right? If you sat there and decided that you don't want to pay taxes, and so you're fine with not getting a public defender if you're accused of a crime, but you also aren't well off enough to afford a lawyer of yourself, then at that time period when you're standing in the courthouse without a public defender, you may be going, okay, I probably should have had a system in place to pay taxes so that I could have a public defender, right? So taxes in this sense are like insurance. Okay. And what I've been talking about are taxes that I think indicate fair value, indicate something given in return. And you may disagree with what that money is spent on, but the idea is that there are very basic things we spend taxes to keep in place. And if we look at least American taxes today, one, they aren't enough to cover the debts. And two, most spending by the government is mandatory, is in Social Security or Medicare and Medicaid, at least for the United States. Some of it is for defense, and a very, very, very small sliver of the rest of that is for things like national parks, national museums, scientific studies, and so on. So when we look at what our taxes being spent on, we can also ask, what percentage of our taxes are going to certain activities and so on. But to come back from my present blabbering, he's talking about a view which says taxes are when the government comes to me and says, you give me money. You owe me money. You owe me money for existing. You owe me money for living on the land. You owe me money because we say you have to pay in for this cost, right? Healthcare, right? If you owe me money because you engaged in commerce, and that commerce used roads and ships and ports and so on. But it does not feel very good, right? When you are sitting there and not doing anything, at least not as far as you understand, right? You're sitting there at your house and you go to work, you go home, and then a tax bill comes, you have to pay it. Meanwhile, you are paying for the sewer, the garbage, the water, the electricity. If the roof falls down, or all the shingles blow off, you have to pay for it. If the house burns down, well, you have to pay for it. Or you have some sort of insurance, but it's not public insurance, right? It's insurance you pay for, and that's separate. Until, of course, you have like some sort of national disaster happening and the government comes in and foots the bill for all the houses that are blown down in a hurricane, for example. What I mean to say is that the view on taxes is often that the tax is theft. The tax is a cost for living. And I'm not sure that's always true. I think that sometimes it can be. It can feel like that for certain. But part of the problem arising out of that is that we often do not see what our taxes are spent on. We hear about Medicare and Medicaid being big costs, and our taxes are spent on those. But how often do you see, oh, look how many people's lives were saved because you paid your taxes? Look at the new roads we can get because you paid your taxes. Look at the new school building we have because you can pay your taxes. We don't hear about these stories very often because a lot of tax is for maintenance. A lot of tax is invisible. A lot of tax is just things keep working. But what happens when things do not work, right? What happens when the roads are full of potholes? What happens when the police can't even be bothered to take time out to come to your neighborhood? Or if you do call them, they arrive 7 hours after the incident. What happens if you are paying a bunch of money for taxes, but you don't, but your healthcare still sucks, and all these other poor people and people who don't pay taxes theoretically, are getting subsidized healthcare, but you're not. What happens when you go to register your car and you have to pay a tax for that? You have to pay you get a sticker to say that you've paid the registration tax. What happens when you go to get a driver's license or an ID and you have to pay for that? What happens when you go to a museum somewhere and this museum is a state museum, but you still have to pay for a ticket to get in? What happens when you go to a park and you have to pay to walk into a national park? It sure feels like you're paying for the access, you're paying for the paper you're paying for the sticker, you're paying for the action, and that your taxes don't support it. But in reality, you can look at almost anything, like the road system, the train system, and the fares don't pay for the fares do not cover the full economic cost of the activity. They receive subsidies from the government. And you can say that you don't want subsidies to be spent. You can say that the government shouldn't be doing this. And I think that is a more solid foundation. But then there also happen to be times where there is a tax on living, right? There is a tax because you own a house. They can be a tax because you own a plot of empty land somewhere. And this is frustrating because why, if I own a plot of empty land that I'm going to build a house on in like 40 years, why am I paying taxes on it? It's of no use to anybody. I'm just paying rent to the government is what it feels like. And I'm talking about taxes in a modern society, right? When you go back earlier and earlier, when you end up as a peasant and the Lord is taking 10% of your harvest, that's a tax as well, but you didn't consent to it. And it sure feels like theft because you don't understand anything the Lord is doing. And as well, it can be theft straight up when too much is taken and spent on private endeavors. I need a new castle. I need a new statue of me put up. I need a new airplane. I need a new dance hall. I need a new set of clothes. I need more guards. I need a better quality bed sheet. These sort of things. Well, then that sure feels like theft. Why am I improving your life? Like, what am I getting back for taxes? And that's, to me, where the question should be asked. What are we getting back for taxes? And are these taxes fair, what we are receiving? But the author begins with just taxes or theft. And that's probably one of the early problems I have with it. I think this comes from the way he is talking about taxes in a historical sense. Okay, let me get to the first page that I marked. Here we go. Okay, he talks about a tax the Israelis in AD 132 paid to the Romans. It says, in the end, the Jews were forbidden to ever set foot in Jerusalem, and their ranks were infiltrated with spies. The Babylonian Talmud tells the story of 3 rabbis talking in the presence of a Roman spy during the AD 132 uprisings. The first rabbi praised the Romans for providing bridges and beautiful cities. The second rabbi was silent, but the third rabbi said all these things were done to collect Roman taxes. The Romans responded by exalting the first rabbi, banishing the second, and ordering the death penalty for the third. So he begins out talking about these ancient empires, and that ancient empires, the Babylonians, the Romans, the Greeks, and so on. The Egyptians as well were primarily tax-gathering empires, right? Like, you conquer a new land, you show up with a bunch of warriors, and you say, give me 10% of what you have, or else I burn your city down. And there was no real understanding of fairness going on here. It was straight up, the feeling is, I'm going to take your stuff. And the idea, at least, is that the overlords defend you in a feudal system. But at least in these early empires, you better not question the tax, right? If you think the taxes are too much, you think the taxes are not being spent wisely enough, don't say a word. You stand, if you want to survive, you stand there and say, taxes are great, they are at a good level. Our overlords are spending the taxes in wise and productive ways. This means that bad taxes cannot be spoken of openly, and so they are spoken of secretly. So what he thinks happens is that you begin to have tax evasion. He starts to espouse his view that tax evasion is primarily the method of a populace of speaking out about taxes which they do not support. The idea is, if the castle lord shows up once a year and says, "Give me 1% of what you have. I built these walls. I have soldiers. I enforce the law." Then he says, then the author of this book seems to think that most people would pay it gladly because they understand what they're getting in return. But you come asking for 2% next year, or 5%, or 10%, and all of a sudden, the income people can report, that the wealth people have, that they let you know about, begins to shrink. Suddenly, all of a sudden, you're asking for 20% of everything, and you get 20%, but you're getting 20% from 8 times less people than you were before when you were asking for 1%. All of a sudden, the rich who are able to travel start disappearing from your city. All of a sudden, the gold that was in the strong boxes of the merchants has disappeared. You can't find it. And they don't know what happened to it. You end up torturing a few folk and finding, oh, they buried some of it. Others, was sent overseas. It was sent by camel to another city. In others, it was used to buy property as a way of squirreling away money. So they don't own gold, which can be taken from them. Instead, they own a building or a plot of farmland and so on, which is harder to take. So he looks on tax avoidance as a sign of the times, right? That if you end up asking a 20% or 50% tax from people, then they just won't pay that. And how will they not pay it? They will escape the open economy, the upper air economy, the reported economy. As a leader, if you collect too many taxes, you begin to suffer problems of tax evasion, and then these problems become widespread because it's easier and easier and easier to join the underground organizations, to dance around the official system and not pay taxes. And then you are, as the overlord, taxing all those who have the honesty to report their real income and what they really owe to you, and the people who do not report to you, they get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier because they aren't paying that 20% tax. And all of a sudden, after a few decades, you are trying to enforce a tax with less money, and you end up fighting the people you're against. And then there's an uprising in the city because you're collecting too many taxes, and you have to go put that down. And in the process of putting down a rebellion in one part of your country, you devastate the city, you kill a third of the populace, and the ones that remain don't pay a whole lot of tax because you just burnt half their city down. And this ends up being a losing bet, right? That charging too much in taxes, trying to be too greedy, ends up with your own downfall. So what we should do is keep taxes low, keep government on a tight leash, and not be so afraid of people talking about taxes. Not be so afraid of people questioning taxes. Because unless the overlord is in every city, in every interaction, in every exchange of goods, then there will be events happening which you are not aware of. And these events will grow and grow and grow until your tax scheme does very badly in comparison to the underground economy. So that this pursuing of taxes ends up being about control, because you need more money, so you spend money to enforce the taxes, which makes people try to avoid taxes more because you're taxing them, because you have to raise taxes in order to pay for those soldiers who are trying to extort money from people. And this is a vicious circle where you end up burning down cities, destroying your tax base, spending more and more money trying to protect that tax base while getting less and less back. So he's basically saying we shouldn't even begin this. What we need is for the people to speak up. Okay, he says, to the Greeks, the badge of liberty was indirect taxation. The individual is not taxed directly. What is taxed is some commercial activity, such as a sale, import, or use of a public facility, such as a road, a bridge, a sea lane, or a harbor. The taxes were justified because the money was needed to cover the cost of maintaining these facilities. Okay? So this is one way to justify taxes, no matter how high. You say something like, I'm not going to tax your income. I'm not going to tax what you grow. But if you use my gates, if you use my roads, if you use my ports, if you use my lighthouse, if you use my bridges, that I built, if you walk along the roads patrolled by my soldiers, then you pay a tax for doing that. And this is not a tax, this is an exchange. I built this, I own this, now in order to use it, pay me. And if you don't like it, then you can go and use somebody else's roads, use somebody else's ports, use somebody else's soldiers. And in theory, this works, this is fine, but it has several problems, right? What if it has to do with where the burden falls, right? The burden falls on the merchants overall, on the merchants who use these facilities. If you are the commander of a city and you own all the roads, all the gates, all the harbors, then this tax for even the individual citizen means that if you are too poor, you cannot use the roads, the harbors, the gates, and so on. That is, this works, indirect taxation works, as long as you do not have to pay the indirect tax. But when you end up having to pay it, because there's nowhere to escape to, because you can't leave and join the Cossacks, or you can't head west and leave the state, enter unincorporated territory, then it seems to me it is a tax which will fall upon the regular person. And if it does not, then that means the regular person is not using your roads and your bridges and your harbors, which means that you are pushing down economic activity, right? Now, this is a way to justify taxes, but what it does is it makes the actions harder of people trying to use your facilities. The same happens for cars, for example, in the modern day, when you have to register a car, or when you have to file something at the court and pay a fee, or when you sell your house, you have to pay a stamp tax to the government for the privilege of selling your house, right? Because you used the government's legal system to do it. Well, that is a justified tax that makes sense. The person paying the tax is the one who uses it. But this also has the effect of depressing economic activity. Maybe not a whole lot, maybe, $75 to register your car, or $125 or $200 or whatever it is right now, wherever you are, isn't a whole lot. It's a week's or 2 weeks worth of gas, but it might not be possible for someone, or someone might pay it, but they have to skimp on food, or someone might pay it, but because they couldn't afford rent, and they need the car to get to their job, and now they're $100 short on rent because they had to pay a fee, and this only may impact a very, very, very small number of your population, but it will affect somebody. There's always somebody on the edge of an economic situation where that extra cost means something. If you want to file a lawsuit with the court, if you want to file for divorce, if you want to defend yourself against an accusation, then there's a filing fee for this, a filing fee for that, right? If you want to use the trains, the city's trains or light rail or subway, well, then you pay for that. And, this helps to maintain the system, but it also means that there's somebody out there who cannot afford the $2.25 for a subway ticket. So they won't use your subway. And you're losing out on economic activity because of that. So there's an cost. So one of the arguments for not charging, one of the arguments for not giving a indirect taxation is that there are outsized effects of it. It is more easy to justify indirect taxation, for certain. And it may make sense, very clear sense in sometimes, right? Like gasoline has a tax because, and if that tax is used to maintain the roads, well, the only 95% of the reason somebody is going to buy gasoline is for the roads. A tax to register a car makes sense if that registration is used to, run the DMV, for example. But then you get into all these sort of nasty questions. Do we charge the full economic cost? Is there a charge level that makes sense? in the United States, I've heard many people say that, we should have universal health care, but there should also be like a $25 cost for a doctor's appointment, right? Like healthcare shouldn't be absolutely free, because having that cost, even if it's $25, even if it's $5, even if it's 50 cents, means that people won't take advantage of it as much, right? Because you only need one person to say, oh my gosh, it's free. Well, I'm a hypochondriac and I have to have a different problem every day of the year for the next 15 years, which means how many thousands of doctor's visits? And if you had to pay $25 for each of those, you may not take your hypochondriac syndrome that seriously. You may only go in once a week. You may sit there and complain about your problems and so on. What can happen is, if you are, you're homeless, you have no place to go, sometimes you end up sleeping in a hospital emergency room, simply because it's the only place where you can go and get some food, where you can go and you don't have to worry about being set upon by wild dogs or thieves or muggers or whatnot, and you can get a few hours shut-eye, and that's perfectly fine. But it can also be taken advantage of, right? What if one person shows up and they're homeless and they sleep in the hospital waiting room? I don't have a problem with that. I don't think anybody has a problem with that. You need a few 5-6 hours of shut-eye. You're one person, probably not an issue. 5 people show up, 10 people, 30 people, 100 people. Now all of a sudden, the use of an emergency room is not possible because it's overcrowded with people sleeping. And this is an extreme example where we go down a slippery slope, but it's something to ask. Do we want an indirect tax for using certain facilities, or for using certain things? Like there is a charge for filing a lawsuit, $125 to the court or whatever to file a personal injury claim, to get this paper passed through. And the idea is that this stops at least some amount of people from filing these claims. If there was no cost whatsoever to an activity, then someone may easily take advantage of that. But by adding even a small cost to that activity, it disincentivizes extreme overuse, is the idea. Of course, this also means that somebody somewhere will not have the $25 to pay for a doctor's visit when they need it. When they need to visit the doctor, and somebody gets left behind. So you have to balance these costs of an indirect taxation if you apply it. Okay. He talks about he says, no one was exempt from the Esophora, an Athenian wartime emergency tax, but it always retained its special wartime emergency character, which is unusual. Almost all wartime emergency taxes that are productive of revenue continue after the emergency is over. The Greeks are among the few people in history to have successfully limited extraordinary taxes to the emergencies that prompted them. I mean, that makes sense, and I want to innately tend to agree with it, but at the same time, I don't actually know a whole lot of examples. He does not give many examples in this book of taxes which are emergency taxes, only temporary, which turn out to be permanent. We've seen recently there are at least in the United States, tax breaks, which become permanent. So I do have to wonder about this. It is something which I think is true to a great extent. If you are an organization that then takes money from doing something, then you want to argue for that money-producing activity to continue. Now, if you are the police union and you get a certain percentage of the money collected from tickets that you go out sent to you, then you are going to argue that we need higher tickets, higher cost tickets to give out, that the penalties should be higher. You're going to argue that the laws should be tougher because this is a danger and that's a danger. And you're doing this with an argument for good reasons, with an argument and statistics that show what sort of effect, raising the cost of running a red light, 50% would do. It would reduce red light collisions by this much and so on. But you're also taking a very purposeful view of that, right? You are trying to see, how do I justify my tax here? Well, let's come up with something. There are reasons for any tax, and the emergency tax is one thing that happened, and then when you declare, well, when is the emergency over? Never. That's a whole different problem. I think that's a greater political problem. So I think this is true for individual claims, right? For taxes that are productive of revenue have a tendency to continue, or have a tendency to be pushed to continue by the organization that collects and benefits from the taxes. But I do have to question, emergencies and so on. I think that there are emergency taxes that happen in case of emergency, right? Like, I was reading about there was a raisin supply issue that had happened. The United States had a strategic raisin reserve, in order to control the price of raisins. Or you can have a strategic wheat reserve. We make sure to keep enough wheat for 6 months of use at all times. And I know that those have a tendency to keep going long after they aren't needed. Like, we had a strategic cheese reserve, hundreds of thousands of pounds of cheese kept just in case. And today we have, strategic oil reserves kept in caverns underground, millions of gallons of barrels of oil we have just in case. So these are taxes of a kind that they take. Although perhaps, okay, what percentage is there's a difference between you have to donate 48% of your raisins to the strategic raisin reserve, and the government has to buy oil from oil producers for its own reserve. But you can also have situations like the government buys oil from oil producers for its oil reserve, but it buys the oil at a certain set price, which may or may not have any relation to the actual free economic fair, price, the actual price in the open market. And so you have to look at individual events, I think, to really understand this. Instead of generalizing to emergency taxes never go away, I think it is more useful to think of taxes tend to not go away, or there's always some the organization that benefits from a tax will always argue for that tax to continue. Conversely, I would imagine that the organization who is paying the tax, or the organization who does not see a benefit from the tax, the organization who suffers from the tax, will almost always push for the tax to be lowered. So if you look at what taxes are lowered in a country, that gives us an idea of who holds the actual political power in a country. Whereas taxes being raised does not necessarily show the same issue, because taxes are raised by particular organizations. And so perhaps a raised tax shows more how much political influence or how much influence an organization has in a political system without necessarily being able to rule the political system. If that makes sense. If I'm the local police and I am very productive of my revenue that comes from traffic tickets, then and traffic ticket penalties keep going up, then that indicates that the local police union has a lot of political influence in City Hall, for example. But that does not indicate that the local police union is the overpowering political leader of the system. Whereas if traffic tickets are lowered, this indicates that whoever is in charge of the system is pushing against the wishes of the police department, in this case, for higher traffic tickets. Just to give one very limited example. There's probably a lot of nuance in there, but it's a thought. Okay, so this, I think, is here, when he talks about here, part of why people worry about taxes so much. Like, when are taxes the worst? Okay. He says, the following words from a 5th century BC Athenian, although a bit cynical about life in general, pinpoint the fears of that day about the esephora, the emergency tax. Any human being who counts on having anything he owns secure for life is very much mistaken. And this is when taxes are most dangerous. This is the worst taxes. When a tax is used to take away something that you felt you had secure for life. The most obvious example is property taxes levied by a county or a state on the federal government on your house, which, if you don't pay, the government in whatever form will then take your house, sell that house, and take their money, and then give you some of the money, right? But that you may have thought, hey, I bought a house, I live here, it's mine. And yet the county says, you owe property tax because you own property in this certain area. Or you are hooked up to the sewer system, you are hooked up to the electricity system. And you have to pay a fee for that, even if you don't use the electricity system. Here's a 25% hookup fee. And what do? You go to the city hall and say, hey, I am not paying this $25 hookup tax. Is it really worth the fight? And is there even a mechanism for not paying that tax? If you if you pay property taxes in a school district and you go to the city hall and say, hey, I don't have kids, I didn't grow up here, I didn't learn anything from the school, why am I having to pay a property tax? Do you think you can get out of that? There may be a mechanism for lowering property taxes, but you're not going to be able to stand there and effectively argue that you shouldn't pay a property tax. Why? Because the government's going to say, no, for this reason, or because it's the law. And that's a danger, right? If a tax is just for the reason that we have passed a law, or a tax is used in order to take something. There was, I remember I was watching a YouTube video earlier in this year that was talking about a problem in some city in America somewhere, where what would happen is the city would fine property owners for certain things. Your gate isn't painted, for example. There are too many weeds in your yard. The tree behind your house is a fire hazard, and if you don't trim it, you're going to have a fine, sort of thing. Or you levy a special tax on the area to improve the roads a certain amount. and this one person didn't pay it. That is, you force taxes on a population. The city government forces taxes on a population, and the people in this population who own houses, that is, have something of value, but do not have the cash flow to pay these taxes and these charges, end up getting passed to some sort of collections order by the city, who says, you owe us $3,000 or you owe us $30,000 in back taxes and back fees and penalties, and now we're going to take your house. So then the city would take the house, and one or two things would happen. Either the city would take the house, and that's it, right? They take the house. The value of the house is theirs. They would sell the house to someone and keep all the money from the proceeds of the house because you had forfeited your house by not paying taxes. So they take everything. And the other thing that could happen is the city, takes your house, sells your house, and the city is taking so many houses, selling so many houses, that the prices of the houses in the public auctions are very low. $300,000 houses are going for $125,000 in public auctions. Because there could be so many being sold at the auctions. It could be the case that you have good houses in there, but also, dilapidated, abandoned houses in there, dragging down the cost of the whole thing because you're not going into these houses and doing an inspection for what you buy. You're standing in a room looking at a picture of a house and hoping that there's nothing terribly wrong with it, but you don't have a lot of information, so housing prices get depressed. Or maybe there is a friend or relative of a city council member who happens to own a real estate development company and tends to bid on these houses and gets the inside scoop on which ones are good and which ones are bad. And the person involved in all this, the citizen, is just one lonely person, one lonely being trying to fight City Hall. And if they want to win against City Hall, then they need lawyers, they need help, they need people to care, they need it to be mentioned in the news, they need a change in the law, they need to be dragged before the courts. It might take years. And meanwhile, you're standing there, I lost my house because I didn't pay $3,000 worth of taxes. Or, you could have the city's like, we told you about the taxes, and you go, you sent the tax notification to the wrong address for 12 years. And so I was never notified that I had to pay these taxes. I would have, but you didn't send them to me. And now all of a sudden the city's trying to take my house, and I'm going to fight that, and it's costing me $40,000 in lawyer fees over a $3,000 tax bill the city couldn't even bother to send me and do that correctly. So the same happens, if your car is impounded by the police because you were caught speeding or something, or because you didn't have registration, right? And they say, well, we're gonna take, or it was parked in the wrong area, and they have to tow it. And after they tow it, they say, well, you owe us $250 because we towed your vehicle. And you're going, I made a mistake. Does that mean I should lose what I have? I didn't do anything that wrong. I have to now pay this cost in order to just get back what is mine already. Or I have to pay the property taxes on the house or on my empty plot of land, or else I lose what I have and I have to pay this forever. So I cannot at any point rest on my laurels. And taxes keep going up, and and somebody keeps voting for school bonds that now I have to pay. And I voted against that, but my side lost by 51% of the vote to 49. A simple majority had it. And all of a sudden, if you're on the edge, you lose everything. And if this happens too much, you have a problem. Because What if the city becomes very productive? Sorry, the city becomes very protective of this revenue producing system. What if a member of the city council is benefiting from this, and so all of a sudden you have a mayor or something who is very against changing this law and keeps sabotaging meetings or voting against it, or losing paperwork, or whatever the case may be. And the city says, well, if you want your money back, if you want your house back, you're gonna have to sue us, and that's going to involve lawyers and tens of thousands of dollars on your side. Meanwhile, we do this every day, and we have an in with the judge or something, and it's troublesome, and you're just sitting here in your house going, I could lose this. I don't actually, and that's the worst feeling, right? When taxes are such that you feel I don't actually own something, I'm only renting it from somebody else. These rent collecting activities. When taxes emulate rent, that's a problem. And you can be kicked out, or stuff can be stolen from you because you don't pay taxes. Then you have a great trouble. I think you have a great danger, and people become very angry. So at the very least, I would argue that taxes should be used as a lien on a property, right? When you sell this house, then you pay the $3,000 to the city. But just because you owe $3,000 or $30,000 to the city in back taxes doesn't mean that the item gets, or the house is taken from you, right? Taxes should not be used to take things from people. And there may be very good reasons for taxes and so on, but I think that at the very least, taxes are important for maintenance of a lifestyle, maintenance of a country, maintenance of a system. And if you take houses from people, you take land, you take cars, you throw people in debtor's prison, literally or figuratively, then you end up chipping away at that very system which taxes are meant to protect. And some taxes are used to improve things, but if your taxes cannot even ensure that people's property is safe from the government, then you have a problem, right? Because eventually you're going to have people hiding their tax, hiding the costs, or trying to cheat the government, or becoming very angry and wandering into City Hall with a shotgun because they don't have any place to live, and they're 84 or something, and they're in despair. And that is the lesson here, that the cost of not paying taxes should not be too terrible, because this is the very worst thing you fear. It's not only that I have to pay for using things, but I have to pay for even existing. I have to pay for breathing. And so if you do that, you're not free, you're just a slave. And taxes are not an exchange, but theft. So if you have the power to tax, you should be very careful not to use that power to take. Because the point of taxes in a modern functioning economy, at least, is money. Right? To get money from people so that you can spend that money on things. When you take taxes in kind, perhaps there may be a difference here, right? If I take 20% of your harvest, or I take 20% of your olive production, for example, it becomes a bit more complicated, because if the government takes 20% of your olive production and you don't give it to them, so the government decides to say, well, you owe us, you didn't pay taxes, so we're going to take all your olive orchards. Then what happens is the government now owns the means of production. And that comes with its own issues and problems, right? Like, how do you keep the production going? You need labor. Now, the person who owned it, instead of being rich, is poor, or has to work for the government in order to produce olives in the olive tree, and isn't likely to produce as much or be as innovative, and so the entire system, in this manner of, like, you end up in a sort of communist system where the government controls everything, owns everything, and there's no benefit to working harder. So the entire system starts to suffer from a malaise and a sickness. You aren't quite destroying the foundations of your society, but you are certainly refusing to allow them to push themselves up higher. Okay, so he talks about the Athenian Empire. The Athenian Empire was a system whereby Athens and several other cities formed a group in order to protect Greece against her enemies. You know, the Athenian League, what it was called. And what eventually happened is, it started out, everyone is, we're in this together, and we're paying, we each send soldiers to join a league-wide army, a NATO army, for the Athenian days in ancient Greece. And eventually some cities are like, hey, we don't want to send soldiers, we'll just send some money. And you can hire, and Athens can hire soldiers. And so eventually many of these cities start sending money. And Athens likes this a whole lot, because they're sending money to hire soldiers, and Athens gets to decide where the soldiers are hired from. And meanwhile, there's a bunch of gold sitting in the Athenian treasury that can be very useful on occasion. And then some cities say, we don't need the Athenian League, and they start to rebel against Athens. We're not going to pay you the tax. We don't need your protection. Athens says, oh, yes, you do, and goes and attacks them and assaults their cities. So now the group of cities around Athens are paying Athens not to protect themselves from an outside threat, like the Macedonians or the Persians, but instead to protect themselves from Athens. And now Athens is collecting a tax. Athens is saying, give us money or we will destroy you. It is a theft tax. And this tax is then used by Athens. Tribute from the weaker city-states around them meant a fat treasury, extravagant public works, and wages for thousands on the public payrolls. Jurors could now be paid along with the 10,000 rowers in the Athenian navy. Sculptors and architects could be hired to design and build the magnificent Parthenon and the Acropolis at the edge of the city. The tyranny suffered by the weaker city-states was unimportant because of the economic good these taxes did for Athens. This sort of reasoning is still used to justify oppressive taxation. If you have taxes that you are taking from an area or taking from a group, and then you spend those taxes on yourself, then the group you are taxing is going to ask, why are we paying these taxes? We're not getting any benefit from them. You know, if I'm saying, give me money, and I'm going to build myself a bigger house. I'm going to build myself better roads. I'm going to build myself statues. I'm going to build my town, and my people has now become the center of the artistic and the economic world, and the little city-state out there paying taxes becomes less important, and all their young, bright youth are traveling to Athens because that's the only place to go if they want to get ahead in the world, because now they are farming and paying taxes to Athens for Athens to improve itself. Meanwhile, their roads are getting worse. Their safety is now under threat. You know, their harbors are having problems. Their merchants are being outcompeted by Athenian merchants, and their city is slowly dying on the vine, where they still pay taxes to Athens. So if you are collecting taxes from a place, there is this idea that those taxes should be spent in the local area. You know, if I'm paying taxes to the state capital, then I don't really want to see new buildings, new government buildings and shiny statues and memorials being created in the capital. I'm like, sure, that's nice for the capital, but what I want to see is good roads in my city. What I want to see is more teachers being hired in my schools. What I want to see is my library receiving a grant from the state government in order to function. And that grant is just my tax money returning to me, but it's tax money that is being spent in the local area. Although when this idea is taken to an extreme, then taxes become less important. In that if I am sending a bunch of money to the federal government and the federal government is now sending that money back to me, then why am I paying taxes to the federal government? I could just take those taxes and spend it on myself. Okay? So at an extreme level, if you take a tax from an area and you send back only the tax from that area and never more, never less to spend in that area, then the central organization there's no reason for it to exist. Okay? The point of collecting taxes is to then redistribute those taxes for the betterment of the entire group. It's like if I am Athens and I'm collecting taxes from city A and city B, then I can decide to spend that money on a road between city A and city B. Okay? Because city B is going to pay for a road, and city A isn't going to pay for a road. But I, as Athens, as the central authority, as the federal or the state government, can say there can be a benefit for both of you from building this. Or you say that you are collecting taxes from city A and city B, and city A has a crime problem. And so you spend some of the tax money from City B on City A to get rid of City A's crime problem, because a crime problem in City A is A, expanding and causing issues, B, threatening the stability of City A, and if City A is totally gone, you're in big trouble, and C, the idea is that by reducing the criminal element in City A, then you increase the legitimate element in City A, you make it more economically prosperous and so on. And so as an effect of this growth in City A sends more taxes, and now you can spend more taxes to City B for its help. And it is a virtuous circle where the central government, City A and City B, all grow better and faster because money is wisely spent. Because City A doesn't have enough resources to solve its own problem, but City A, B, and C, U, together do have resources to solve City A's problem. And so when you are spending taxes, one thing I've heard from relatives of mine, given that I live in California, is the statistic that California sends more money, more tax money to the federal government than it receives in federal benefits. That California is subsidizing the other poor states, because you have other states like, I don't know, Alabama. Right, we can always pick on Alabama? There's one state that's like, is it Alabama or Mississippi? It's like, there's a joke somewhere. It's like, thank God for Mississippi because at least I don't live there. Thank God for Alabama. It's like one of those states. The idea is that, one is 49th in the country and the other one is 50th. So the 49th state can at least say, hey, at least we ain't number 50. At least we're on top of somebody. Where was I going with this? Yeah, so the idea is that, California is sending money to the federal government. The federal government is then sending extra money to one of these states, and the hope is that it will improve one of these states, right? That if there's an economic problem in South Dakota, for example, that the government can spend tax money in South Dakota in order to push its economy upward, add some infrastructure, improve education, and fix a road or a railroad or something. Build a new airport, which helps South Dakota rise, and then eventually South Dakota doesn't need California's money to survive at its present level because we have fixed the problem. And because we have spent money wisely, and now South Dakota is producing more money than it takes in federal resources. And the hope is that eventually every state is sending more taxes to the feds than the feds spend on them. So now the federal budget has a surplus, and the federal budget can pay off debts or can take on debts more than it would have otherwise in order to spend even more money in the country, or can spend money by sending it to other places. Mexico has a problem with drug cartels, so we're going to spend money to help Mexico fight its own drug cartels, even though Mexico doesn't pay us any tax, because a calm and prosperous Mexico is good for the United States. And there's a virtuous circle. But what can also happen is a brand new building in the state capitol. Oh, sorry, in DC, in DC capital. What can also happen is some pork barrel agreement where the federal government, gives $500,000 to some company in the middle of nowhere to, build ready to eat meals for MREs for the military. And these MREs are not built for the highest quality or the lowest price. Instead, these MREs are low quality and high price. Somebody is getting a bunch of extra money for this. Or when the decision is made to put a museum or put a study group or put some, space command or something, right? Where do you create a new space command, and where do you put its headquarters? Well, that's a lot of money going into a local area. Or where do you have a missile production line, and that the federal government the federal government spends its tax money unwisely, or the federal government spends its tax money beautifying DC at the expense of other parts of the state, or the federal government spends money, improving, Texas or something. Meanwhile, milking California or Missouri for all it's worth. And these are just various ways of saying, unwise spending by taxes, where you create the opposite of a virtuous circle. You create a cost where you stand and you're saying, look what they got, look what they got, look what they got, and what do I have for my taxes? Or you hear about waste. We spent how much money on a study of how long pencils last in a pencil sharpener? Oh my gosh, why did we spend, billions of dollars building littoral combat ships that don't work? What's going on here? And I'm sure you can look up examples of government graft. I'm sure you can look up bits and pieces. Like, what's the recent bit? Something about sending money to Venezuela, or spending money on ICE by the federal government just today is an issue where we're going, well, this is, or at least a substantial percentage of the population is going, this doesn't seem like the best idea. That this is not the most optimal way to spend our money. But of course, the people in charge, the federal government, the Athenians, the state government, is going to say, no, we know what we're doing. Trust us. The fact that Athens is getting a new statue is good for you. Aren't you proud? You're part of the Athenian League, and Athens is getting a new golden statue of her greatest hero, and you are part of the league, and you are with us, and so you should be proud. You should benefit. And I'm betting that, like, Corinth does not feel this. If you hear something about, we're spending so much money on building a border wall, and then you see a picture of someone climbing that wall, you're going, we spent how many billions of dollars? We spent, money being sent to contractors who know somebody who knows somebody. We made rush orders and paid extra for them for a fence that doesn't seem to work very well. And you start asking questions. You can also ask questions like, we spent money to, I don't know, create unisex bathrooms, and I disagree with that sort of thing. You could say, like, we spent money subsidizing electric car production, and I disagree with that. I don't hold the same views, but that's a legitimate idea someone can have. It's a legitimate complaint, an opinion, where you say, well, I don't think you're spending my tax money wisely. And when we ourselves spend our money unwisely, we know there's no one to blame but us. Nobody made us buy, the PS Vita that I haven't used for 4 years that's just sitting there. No one made me buy the flute that I should have practiced, but I don't. No one made me buy this fancy car that strokes my ego. I bought it myself. But when somebody else takes our money and spends it, then we can say, I didn't agree to that. I don't think that's a good idea. Why do we need another stoplight here on this intersection? Why do we have, 4 speed bumps on this stretch of road when there wasn't a speed bump when I was a kid here? Why do we need this? Why are we building another school structure when we don't pay our teachers enough for a living wage, sort of bit? And just, it can be dangerous if you spend taxes and you don't justify the wisdom of what you were spending them on, or you spend taxes and there is extreme doubt whether those taxes are being spent well or wisely or honestly, that there isn't a bunch of graft in play, then the feeling the taxpayers have for that is not good. And you might start thinking, maybe I shouldn't pay my tax because it'll be used unwisely. Maybe I shouldn't pay my tax because it supports this action, or it supports, a war in Vietnam. Or, ICE raids on locals. Or the construction of a road, the repair of a bridge that seems to have been ongoing for 10 years and never stops. Or a train system from San Francisco to LA, which suffers from all these problems and delays. You start going, why are we spending this money? What's going on? And people get angry about that. People make speeches. People start thinking, maybe I don't trust what I'm being told by the government. Maybe I don't trust what the Athenians are telling me because I can see with my own eyes that something is wrong here. And you start to have troubles. You start having rebellions or evasion. Okay, he talks here about the Greeks. He says, the Greek revenue system was progressive, which means that the richer citizens paid an increasingly larger share of the cost of government and of maintaining society. The farmers, however, were not very prosperous. Okay, So basic subsistence, however, especially among the poor, was not subject to taxation. And this is important, I think. Okay, so we don't tax the poor, or we do not tax the poor very much. Why? On the one hand, you can't squeeze water from a stone. The poor don't have a lot of money. You can tax them all you want. You ain't getting the money from them. But in another way, to be poor in a society is to exist at the lowest level of subsistence. It is to exist in a society, to live in a society without suffering death, essentially. It is to be able to breathe and look and move and understand and presumably work, improve, build yourself up. So it is subsistence, and it's very level. And if you are taxing subsistence, then that means that you can never rise above subsistence. If there is a tax to register your car, then how on earth is someone who has no money supposed to register their car? It simply can't happen. If you need an ID to do all these things, to get a hotel room, to get a library card, to file legal papers, you need an identification for this, then if you charge to get an identification, what you are saying is that if you do not have money to spend on something else besides food and clothing, if you do not even have the bare subsistence, if you don't have money to spend on anything but bare subsistence, then you cannot rent a hotel, you cannot get a library card, you cannot file a lawsuit, you cannot apply for a job. You can't apply for a driver's license because you have to pay a fee to someone in order to get another copy of your birth certificate, for example. And this is one of the dangers of charging for use. You have to first get the money together in order to get to a level where you don't have to subside anymore. Or you are constantly trying to get a little bit of money together so that you have like a place to sleep tonight. I used to work at a hotel, and this is what would happen sometimes, is you would have people coming in and they'd hand me a bunch of $1 bills, right? Or you'd have people coming in who worked at the literally worked at the restaurant next door and came in at the end of the night and said, and counting their tips, going, okay, do I have enough money in tips to afford a hotel room tonight? Otherwise, I'm sleeping on the street. And so every day, you would see the same people come in. It's like every day they work and work and work in order to end up with 50 cents at the end of the night after paying for a hotel and getting food. And what kind of life can you build with that? You can, I have friends who work 3 jobs and yet still end up, they have to pay $2,000 for rent. They have to pay for gas for the car. The car breaks down. They need some money in case of that. And you can see them drag themselves up by their own bootstraps almost with 3 jobs and get to a more comfortable position. But then something happens. They end up with a hernia. They overreach one day. They're keeping 3 jobs, and once they just fall asleep, and it's a no call, no show at their job that runs from 2 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then next week is another no call, no show. And then they get fired from one of those jobs, and all of a sudden it's downhill, and 2 jobs isn't enough to support them. So they end up asking you for money or a loan, and they pay it back eventually when they get a 3rd job again. And then the cycle repeats, and you just watch this going, how do you build a life when your constant struggle is just to survive? And we can't fix all of that, I think. I think it is a whole other discussion to have about, socialized healthcare, socialized housing, the whole welfare system. But at the very least, what we can do is not add extra burdens onto subsistence, and not add extra taxes, not try to pull taxes from a stone. All you end up doing is cracking the stone by crushing it too hard with your hands. And in the same way, we don't want taxes to drag someone down too far. We want it to be, we want a society where you can only fall so far. We want a society where life is a little forgiving, and it's not, you take one misstep, you end up down in the gutter, having your legs broken by Bruno. Or you end up, losing at one stroke, you lose your house, your car, your job, your family, the clothes in your back, and you're wandering naked around the streets. We want it to be a process where we can look, at the very least, you'll survive. At the very least, you can go to some homeless shelter and get a bath, some clothes, some free food you don't have to pay for. So I think there's benefit to a welfare system. But besides that, we don't want a tax that does more than this. Is right. We don't want a tax which ensures the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. We don't want a tax where the rich don't pay anything and the poor pay a whole lot of money, and the poor are always suffering to survive and they can never escape. And then the rich can never become less than rich. We don't want that sort of system either. We want a system where movement is possible, and not taxing the very lowest level at least allows for that movement to happen, I think, or assists in that movement without giving us extra money. Because, part of the problem could also be if you try to squeeze money from the poor, then you have to do that by some sort of means, and that costs something. You have to have a surveillance in place. You have to have a means of tracking people, social security numbers, tax receipts. You have to have an IRS to keep an eye on them. And you can end up in that unvirtuous cycle. You can end up in that downward spiral where you're trying to get more and more money, and you're spending more and more money trying to get less and less money. And plus what can happen, and what has happened, he points out in this book various times, what has happened, especially in the older days, right, in ancient history, is when life is too hard in one place, you move. This happens today. Is life too hard in Colombia or Venezuela? Well, you get up and you start walking north. And eventually you end up in Guatemala or Mexico or the United States, and you try to make a better life for yourself. Now, there are many reasons to leave a land. There could be war. There could be famine. There could be economic troubles. But one of the historic ways to leave, or one of the historic reasons, is a tax. Is that I am stuck here and I cannot hope to rise up. I'm a farmer, and the government takes 50% of my crops every year, and I am left with just enough to feed myself, and I can never escape this because there is a tax system which is crushing the lifeblood out of me. So taxes are a reason people move and leave, destroying the tax base, which eventually destroys the country because it can't collect money. And we cannot control all the reasons someone might leave a country, but what a country can do is control its own taxes. What a country can do is not crush its own citizens. What a country can do is be productive of tax revenue, but productive in a long view. Like how do I have taxes such that I can collect these same taxes 100 years from now? instead of how do I have taxes such that I can pay for the expenditures of my government 2 months from now. Right? And this happens with any revenue system, right? With any expense system. The more short-sighted your view is, the more short-sighted is, I need money for a hotel tonight. I need money for food today. I need money for a transportation to work. Then it's very difficult to build anything, right? Because you are focused on how do I get money quick and quick and quick. The longer your view is, though, the more effective your money engaging activities can be. If I go, okay, how do I retire at 55? Then I'm going to think of a very different way of living than how do I afford rent next month? If I knew to afford rent next month, now I'm really working hard, picking up some extra hours, picking up overtime, getting a second job sort of thing, trying to find a roommate. But if I'm trying to say I'm going to retire at 55, then I'm going to start putting away $100 a month, saving $100 a month and putting it in stocks or bonds or something. And I'm going to keep doing that and keep doing that and keep doing that. And the difference between those two lifestyles is that when you are 55, the person who was just trying to survive, grubbing for money every day, is at 55 still trying to survive, grubbing for money every day. Whereas the person who aimed to retire at 55 and put away that $100 no matter what is able to rest on his laurels. And that comes from a different outlook, I think. Not just money spending patterns, but why do those money spending and money saving patterns exist? Because you're aiming for something. I know I have friends who work a minimum wage job and never seem to have any money. But what they can do is they can save money for a concert. They can say, I go to this rave every year, or I go to the Aftershock, or I go to Burning Man every year. It costs me $1,200 to do it, but I can save up enough for that. Or I go to an anime convention, for example, every month, every year, and I save up and I do that thing. And when they have that goal, they can do it. And yet somehow they never seem to have any money in their daily life. And I'm going, why is that? It's because of the outlook. It's because when they have a goal, they can say they don't spend as much money on food, for example. They don't engage in all their normal activities. And it's not much. You don't buy that latte or that coffee today. And that's $5. And $5 ain't much, but it's enough to afford a $150 ticket every year. And they'll do that. But when they're just focused on today, when they don't have anything to save for, then it's, hey, I need a coffee or I need a Starbucks latte right now, because I want it, because I can afford it. And tomorrow I'm not going to have any money anyway. I'm going to have to work and grub for my daily expenses tomorrow anyway. So I may as well spend the $5 now in order to get the coffee instead of having the $5 tomorrow, because $5 tomorrow in their minds isn't going to make any difference. They're going to have to work just as hard. So he talks about ancient Greece more. He says that it was not a tax or a confiscation of any kind. Called a liturgy, this was a voluntary contribution to the city-state. The rationale of the liturgy was that persons of wealth should voluntarily shoulder the expenses of their city. Public generosity through liturgies was their just duty for the unequal share of the riches of the community they enjoyed. The generosity of the rich Greeks is mentioned in several writings of this period, which indicate that many rich Greeks donated 3 and 4 times what was expected of them. When occasionally the opposite was true, a wealthy person who had not given freely and generously was held up to public scorn. Public sentiment is a powerful force that is not used in our society as much as it should be. Governments try to manipulate it more than listen to it. Okay, so there's a question here. The author thinks this is great. And there are examples of this. For example, you have news articles about so and so bought up 100,000 acres of forest and is protecting it from logging, or is protecting it from this or that, or is turning it into a park or into a nature preserve. And the idea is, hey, this person with a lot of money is doing something with their money for the good of the nation, for the good of the people, and they take pride in that. Or they have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? They start a charity that gives money away and does things. They give grants or scholarships, and it has their name on it. You know, the XJC scholarship, the VJM grant for the study of this or that, for example. And this is a type of liturgy done by those who have enough money to afford the ability to do that. You know, there was a news article I saw some time ago that pops up once in a while on Instagram as a bit of a report, or Reddit. And it's like, you know, so-and-so worked at the school for 50 years and managed to send 33 students to college. You know, he had no kids of his own, so he spent his money on sending on scholarships for children from the school. So the janitor, no one knew it, but the janitor was a millionaire who spent all his millions on doing good things. Or, you know, so-and-so left all their money to the church. You know, they did something good with their wealth. You know, you have fundraising events, which can happen in $400 a plate for fundraising. Okay, I'll do that. Get some accolades. You know, it can be, you know, there's a statue, and so-and-so, you know, paid for the statue. You know, thank you to the XYK Foundation for the statue. Thank you to the Jones family for their generous contribution to the arts. You know, I go to the theater sometimes, and in the back of it says, you know, these are the people who donated money to our theater program, and these are their names, and you know, here's a picture of them with the stars, sort of thing. And this is what he's talking about. But then you also hear other stories, right? So-and-so bought a $400 million yacht. So-and-so has 3 private airplanes. You know, so-and-so threw a wedding that cost $500 million. And these are the opposite. I have a ton of money. I can do what I want with it. And what I'm going to do with it is spend it on myself. And, you know, many people do this. How many folk do you know who go out, buy a fancy car or buy themselves a high-powered speedboat, and they use that car to go to the grocery store and back? They take that high-powered speedboat out on the lake 3 times a year. And, you know, they got something for their money. But you're also going, that's kind of a waste. Like, you're not getting a great return on the investment. You're not getting a wonderful return on the investment here. Your high-powered speedboat, you take out 3 times a year, you know, and then eventually, you know, you sell it, and in a few years from now, after using it 15 times, you know, losing $30,000. You know, I don't know how much the speedboat costs. You know, losing several $1,000s worth of value on it. You know, you have a fancy car, but you don't use it for anything. You have a $400 million yacht, and how much time do you actually spend on it? And do you need a $400 million yacht? What are you getting from a $400 million yacht you couldn't have gotten from a $50 million yacht? Like, I don't understand what the need is for this. And for the author, he sees this as a cultural issue. He sees this as part of how we understand people and their money, right? That if you're rich, you earn that money, and you can use that money however you wish. So if you're rich and you use that money on selfish reasons, then what right have I to criticize that? And what right have I to say that you shouldn't buy a fancy car or a speedboat? What right have I to say that you don't need a McMansion, you live by yourself? You know? But it is also possible to have a viewpoint like you are rich because of the society we live in, and you ought to give something back. You know, you are rich because of luck, because you invested in the right company in the right time, and you didn't do anything to deserve it or own it. You didn't do anything to deserve it, and so it is proper to give something back. Or we look on the person who builds himself owns a penthouse, and we say, wow, that's great, I want to be that person. But we don't look on the person who produces a scholarship for students and say, I want to be that person. You know, who do we revere? Who do we think of as great? The person with the big McMansion, the person who has a castle they built that has 14 rooms, or the person who lived a modest life and spent their extra money sending 33 kids to college. We might admire the poor janitor, but we don't want to be him in many cases. And that has to do with our culture, right? If we don't look at rich people and say, you need to give back to the country, you need to do something. You know, you shouldn't die with $7 billion. There's no reason for you to have $7 billion. You're not using it for anything. You're just building wealth for no reason. You know, if you're building a bunch of wealth and you live on, you know, expenses of $150,000 a year, then why don't you just keep enough wealth to make sure that you have that $150,000 incoming every year? You know, why are you building capital? Like, what's the point? And these are bigger questions to ask, and I'm certainly a very foolish one for asking, in that I am not rich. No, I don't have money. Like, who am I to criticize someone for how they spend their money? Who am I to say that you should give back to society, right? I'm not in a position that I can do that. I'm not in a position to say that well, you know, you understand, I gave away my millions. And I'm a better person because I'm a better person than you because of it. No, I'm some poor brat who's up here talking about how the rich don't do enough. The rich owe me something because I'm a living human being and whatnot. And this is an arrogant viewpoint. But it is something to think about. You know, public scorn and public accolades. Who do we praise for spending their money in certain ways, and why? Okay, he contrasts this system of voluntary contributions, where, you know, the rich would donate for a building or a cause or a statue or a road. And he says, today, we shift a great deal of private wealth to the public sector through heavy taxation and government-managed expenditures. The costs are enormous. Worst of all is the spirit of the whole operation. The donors are neither respected nor honored for their benevolence. In fact, taxpayers, however high a tax they pay, do not know where their money goes. I mean, this is a very legitimate claim, an idea. If I pay taxes I pay sales tax, for example. How much do I know of where my, you know, what is it, 6, 7, 8% right now, sales tax goes? I don't know exactly. I don't track the government money. And I don't, as far as I know, the government is not eager to tell me how they spend my money. The government isn't putting out ads in newspapers saying, okay, this is the tax money you sent us, and this is how that money is being spent. The government, you don't have the governor or the city council standing up and saying to the entire populace during a baseball game, your taxes paid for this baseball game. You instead have a sort of sense that you send money and the government spends money and it's probably for good, but then you hear all these stories about how the money is misused or used for nefarious reasons, or the government isn't very good at spending the money and paid $4 million for a light pole. $40,000 to change a light bulb. I don't know why. Was it a good price? Was it a bad price? Was this government contract worthwhile? I don't know. And it doesn't seem like that the government justifies its expenses very often to the public. Instead, we sort of just feel that it does right or does wrong. We can't choose to not pay a certain percentage of our taxes. Although we can choose not to use certain things, right? If I don't drive, I don't buy gasoline, I don't pay registration taxes, then I'm not supporting the roads. I'm not using the roads. But then again, do I benefit from the roads? I get a package delivered from Amazon, for example. But most of all, I think he talks about the spirit of the whole operation. The donors are neither respected nor honored for their benevolence. When was the last time that you heard someone proudly say, I paid my taxes this year? I am a good citizen. I paid my taxes. I am a citizen that supports this government and this movement and this change. I paid my taxes. No, instead, taxes are seen as theft, as something bad, something shameful. We've heard like Donald Trump brag about, I only paid, $400 in taxes or whatever, this one year, and I did that because I was smart and I took advantage of the tax law, and that's lauded as something good. Look how many taxes he managed to avoid, and there's also a sort of shame about that. Well, so and so doesn't pay their fair share. And I think in our daily lives, we do not see paying taxes as a good and honorable thing. We don't see paying taxes as benefiting people. And partially that is, I feel, because we don't really understand where our taxes go. When was the last ad for Medicare? Right? This is just a public service ad to let people know that your tax is paid for Medicare. And here are 4 or 5 stories of people who would not be alive today if it was not for Medicare, for your taxes, for what you have done. I've never seen a story like that. Occasionally, you might see a political ad, vote for this bill. And there's a picture of like a smiling kid in a dentist chair or something. But when it comes to showing, the maintenance and the results of that maintenance, it's much, much less. In my experience, at least. You might see a little plaque somewhere, paid for with your tax dollars. And that's about the extent of it. A little plaque paid for with your tax dollars on a sign in the freeway next to some construction. When really, if I go outside and I ask what were my taxes spent on, what did my taxes help create, then I can look at the streetlights, I can look at the road, I can look at the sewer system, I can listen to the street sweeper, I can look at the garbage truck coming down the road, I can look at the houses that didn't fall down during the last earthquake, that haven't burned up, I can hear the police or the fire department, I can look at the electricity, and I can go, okay, this is what my taxes have helped do. But I don't do that in daily life, right? I don't normally do that. It's not often I go to the theater and I go, oh my gosh, my taxes helped pay for part of the cost of of everybody's ticket here. I helped create this. The reason I pay my taxes, and my taxes were used to subsidize the theater. When I go to the theater and I see 800 people in the crowd, I can tell myself proudly, I helped pay for every single one of your tickets. I don't think that, unless I focus, unless I try, unless I can attempt to convince myself my taxes are good. And we often seem ashamed of paying taxes. I paid so much in tax last year. It's so terrible, so expensive. I had to survive. I paid these taxes for subsistence. It was stolen from me. And yet, we voted for the tax payments. We said we are willing to have a school bond that raises our property taxes because it's better for the school. And yet, what did that bond pass by? Maybe 60%. So there's large segments of the population saying, well, no, I didn't vote for that. And at what point does this become a problem? If 3 people out of 10 million say, I didn't vote for that, I don't want to pay these taxes, then they don't really cause a problem, right? They can rave as much as they want, be angry, but most people aren't going to listen to them. But when you have 100 million people in a country and all of a sudden 40 million of them are saying, I didn't vote for this, I don't want to pay this tax. Or even worse, you have 60 million people saying, I voted for this, I paid this tax, but I'm not getting what I paid for. The government isn't spending my money wisely. The government, there's a graft and scandal and bribery going on here. And any one of those events could happen, any one of those views, and anything in between. So how do we deal with that? Well, you deal with it by opening up expenses, by having more information, by trying to instill a sense of pride, by saying, we're not going to hide how the money was spent. We're not going to hide that someone, took advantage of this. We're not going to hide how we decided to spend this money. Instead, it's open and available. And not only open and available in the sense that if you go into City Hall and ask for the records of the meeting, you can get it. But no, but like actually told to people. We receive political junk mail all the time. We receive offers from credit card companies all the time trying to get us to spend money. How often do we receive information from the city? This is what your money was spent on. I have seen one. I have seen one time ever sent to this house a pamphlet of information from a government entity explaining their budget. And probably the only reason one of the few reasons I had this opinion is because I've seen that. Is because I can comprehend that there is a system in place for following this money and deciding how the money goes, right? Because I've been in clubs in college where we get a pile of money and we have to decide how to spend it. So it's a meeting and it's an argument back and forth. And I sort of understand in a very vague sense the process. So when I hear this much money spent for that much money spent for this, I want to ask, well, why was that money spent? What went on here? And yet I could figure it out in many cases. It would just require work. I mean, if I was the government, what I would do is I would, take out ads in newspapers, or hire people to do studies, and then pay for these people to go on a talk show somewhere and talk about their study they did about how government money is spent. I would show up with records and say, you can go to this website and there will be a 15-page long PDF which explains the system here. Instead of hiding it and being quiet about it, you bring it into the open. That has its own dangers, of course. Someone's always going to criticize you. But what he's talking about here, the spirit of paying our taxes, and whether we see it as generous or theft. In order to change the viewpoint of taxes as horrible and bad, we have to explain more clearly the good that taxes do, and be willing to take the hits when it turns out taxes were used unwisely. No system wants to do this. No organization wants to go out and explain to the public, we misused your funds, or $30,000 of the city's money is missing, we don't know why. Or it turns out that we paid 4 times market price for the asphalt we used on the roads because there was an incorrect betting system. Or it turns out that we chose the lowest bid for a project and the company we chose the bid couldn't actually complete the project. So now we're paying a second company extra to finish the project because we screwed up on vetting the first one. Someone's going to get fired because of that. Someone's going to get blamed. Someone's going to stand up and say, why did you spend this money? Who made the decision? No organization likes that. The organizations keep things quiet and close to the vest. But, what is good for an organization may not be good for the society, may not be good for the government entire. You may end up shooting yourself in the foot. And he talks about voluntary public service. He says voluntary public service is the alternative to either higher taxes or reduce social programs. Yeah, if we want to do things, if we want to help the homeless, then either you pay someone to help the homeless or you help the homeless out of your own spare time. And he says our society does expect and receive voluntary services for all kinds of community programs as long as they are not government directed. We volunteer for the Boy Scouts and Campfire Girls, but not for fire service or social work. And we'll sweat behind a shovel and get blisters using a pick for any number of community service projects. Or if we lose our job, we will draw welfare rather than accept the pick and shovel to earn a living. And I think he is on to something here. There are voluntary groups and people who volunteer for government programs. They are often at museums, right? Is where I've most encountered volunteers who work at federal or state museums. Are people who are donating their time for government service. There are, volunteering for Boy Scouts and so on is an example of volunteering your time. But there are also volunteering to teach a swim class at the local community college, not getting paid for it, just teaching it, or the local community center. Volunteering to teach a yoga class, volunteering at the local co-op. Volunteering at a food closet, volunteering at, to be a yard duty at an elementary school. These are things people do and things that happen. So I think he is somewhat overestimating the idea that, no one donates themselves to government work. But I think there could always be more of it. Although one of the problems with donating time, right, is that you have to have that time to donate. If you are living on subsistence, if you are scrounging every day, if you are working 3 jobs and just spend your entire Saturday collapsed on the bed trying to recover from the week, then you aren't volunteering your time. So volunteering is the prerogative of those who have spare time to volunteer. I wonder what we could do to change that. You could always have more government positions that pay, like minimum wage or something, and have them and that are easier to obtain. You could offer tax breaks for those who volunteer in order to entice more people to do it. You offer public accolades, right? You have a benefit dinner at the end of the year for all the volunteers at the state fair or the state museum. And the Boy Scouts as an organization pays for a piece of paper that says, thank you so and so for your service, for your dedication, for your years of work. Here's a pin. Here's an eagle pin, or a wolf pin, or a bear pin. Thank you. We give accolades, I think. Thank you to this so and so for all the work you've put in at the community center or helping students study and so on. And I wonder if we could make that more public, perhaps. If we could talk more about these volunteering programs. Like what if there was, you received a pamphlet saying, here are volunteer opportunities in your city. Here are the benefits of volunteering. Or you had work, for example, your work, for example, instead of donating money, you say, okay, everybody take home, these letters, which explain how you could volunteer your time. Or we're going to have a company-wide meeting and the CEO is going to talk and so on. But also we're going to have this philanthropist come up and speak for a few minutes. And we're going to honor this person who has done well and sacrificed their time and effort because they may not have spent money. They may not be rich, but they have time. And they spent that, which is more important than any money in many cases. There's a lot to think about there, I want to say. Okay. So he talks here, the Greeks put taxation on the field of ethics and required that it be measured by standards of justice. Instead of the local satrap coming in and saying, give me money or I kill you, instead of the Babylonians showing up at Jerusalem and saying 10% of everything or I burn the city to the ground, instead of the Egyptian scribes showing up at your farm and saying, give us 20% of what you grew this year or else we throw you in jail. The Greeks, he thinks, at least had the idea that if you're rich, you pay more and we give you, and you pay more voluntarily. Therefore, we give you accolades. You're famous. People take pride in you. People help you when you have problems. People praise you and raise it. A drink to Caesar, for he gave us bread, sort of issue. Or you paid taxes because you used a road or a port, right? But he says, in practice, the Greeks failed miserably. Tax equity or equality was on the basis of tax. Only the citizen enjoyed immunity from the hated direct taxes. Those who control governments has always carried a light tax burden. In a democracy, it means that those classes who have the votes will overburden those who do not. The high tax brackets of today are for the few, not the many, and in that the Greeks were not much worse than we are. And he is against progressive taxation, which is sort of interesting. He's against progressive taxation on ethical grounds, he says. He says that just because the rich are few in number does not mean we should tax them more. That would be taking advantage of a minority. And this is someplace where he's on shaky ground. He says those who control governments has always carried a light tax burden. So I think the most shameful situation to have in a society is when a certain part of the society who benefits from public good does not pay taxes. It does not pay much. In old times in Europe, this would be the church, right? As much as 1/3 of land in England or France at one point was controlled by the Catholic Church, who didn't pay any taxes, and yet still expected to be protected by the king's army, and still expected to benefit from the king's roads and so on. And that's a shameful position to be in. You had nobles who paid very little tax, 2% tax, 1% tax on capital or something, whereas the farmer who grew grain was charged 20% of his production. Today in the United States, you have the ultra-rich pay a lower percentage of their income in taxes than do the middle class, and that's a shameful situation to have. And what does it indicate? It indicates who is in charge, economically speaking, and politically speaking, and the linkage between those two. That if a small class of rich people are politically in charge, then what we will see is lower taxes for the rich than the rest of the society. I don't mean the same level of taxes. I don't mean low taxes in general. I mean proportionally lower taxes than the middle class, for example, than the poor, than the rest. And so when you see this, when you see higher taxes, progressive taxes in some way, then you can ask whether that's good or bad. But I think when you see taxes which are regressive, then those are always bad. Those are always a very bad sign, because in any society thus created on Earth, the rich will be a very small percentage of that society. So a regressive tax is going to, by historical definition, mean higher taxes for more people, lower taxes for a small group. And this is benefiting a small group more than they should be by, population equality. I think there's an argument to be made for taxes which are the same across all levels of income. I may not think it's the best argument, but it is a clear and simple argument to make. But regressive taxes are much more dangerous, I think. Regressive taxes are always, in any case I can think of, a bad sign. Though there are taxes which are regressive in proportion. For example, if you're on Medicare and it's a $25 for a doctor visit, then $25 is a whole lot more of the income of someone who survives just on Social Security than on someone who happens to be a millionaire. $25 for a millionaire is much lower percentage of their income than $25 for someone just barely surviving on Social Security. And so this ends up being regressive in a certain way, regressive in percentage. And it seems silly to say, okay, for the person who is on the Social Security only and lives on a low fixed income, $25 for them is 1% of their wealth, let's say. And so if the rich person wants to go see the doctor, the rich person should pay 1% of their wealth, which happens to come out to $25,000 every time they go see the doctor. And that seems absurd, not least because it removes any incentive to be rich. right? Part of the goal of working to be rich, part of the goal to working to have millions, to working towards being able to retire, is to live a life where you don't have to work all the time. It's to live a life of ease. It's to live a life where you can say, I suffered, I worked extra hours, I worked extra hard, I had to come up with new ideas, and so I deserve my wealth. And then taking a large percentage of my wealth is going to mean that I don't need, once I reach a certain level of wealth, I don't need to go any higher. Right? It would be useless to go any higher, because I'd just be giving more and more of my money away. I'd be working for nothing. And so progressive taxes have a question to ask, right? The book I was reading, Capital in the 21st Century, was talking about progressive taxes on capital, saying that the reason for these taxes is to put a cap on wealth. I mean, straight up, 100%. It is to say that you can only be so rich, you can only have so much of a percentage of the wealth of the country, because beyond that, you don't need the money. It's a moral claim. And his claim here that taxes should be equal is also a moral claim. And I tend to prefer, for my part, the progressive taxes, because it is not only a moral claim, it is also a practical claim. His argument for the practicalness of an equal tax in every direction, an equal low tax in every direction, is, on the other hand, about personal freedoms, is about tax avoidance and evasion, is about keeping the government on a tight rein, is about justice and stability, in short. But I do have a question about this sort of stability, is that a large part of his sources come from older countries, from older ways of living. And those older ways of living, those older taxes, resulted in nobility, resulted in a feudal system, resulted in kings and princes and empires. And I'm not sure that they are correct for the civilization we wish to build. Which is why I still think that that progressive tax on capital or on total wealth makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now. And tomorrow we'll get to part 2 about the Roman taxes. I've been talking about what he says, and so I've been racing forward in the book a bit by mentioning these, and part of what I bring up in the future may be repeating myself. So I will try not to do that and try to get through this a little faster. I know I've said that before, but we'll see what I can do. Until next time,